Thank you, Amy. My beautiful last name is Kulatilaka. I'm Nalin Kulatilaka. I'm a professor here at the Business School at BU, the Questrom School of Business, and also direct the Susilo Institute for Business Ethics. And we are very excited to partner with WBUR and Harvard Business School on this very important set of events. My job here today is to introduce the panel. So let me just very briefly tell you something about each of the panelists. Aaron Muir is the founder and CEO of Clover Food Labs, which operates 12 restaurants in the greater Boston area. Clover is trying to make meat lovers become vegetable lovers. And for most of us, this is one of the things that we do several times a day, which is what we eat. And addressing global warming, it is one of the things that individuals really make decisions constantly, and we need to be informed about it, and hence the panel today. Starting with a food truck in 2008 and opening his first restaurant in 2011, Air has built a passionate base of consumers, 90% of whom are not vegetarians. And then we have Nicole Johnson Hoffman. She is the Chief Sustainability Officer and Senior Vice President of the OSI Group. You may not have heard about them, but they're the company that processes meat and proteins for a large part of the retail and food services industry. Nicole handles their largest global customer, McDonald's, and before that, Nicole's worked for 19 years at Cargill, and she was the founding chairperson of the U.S. Roundtable on Sustainable Beef, and currently serves as the president of the Global Roundtable on Sustainable Beef. And then we have David Perry, who's the president, CEO, and director of Indigo Agriculture, a Boston-based agricultural technology company that works with plant microbes to improve yields of a variety of crops ranging from wheat, cotton, corn, soybeans, and rice. David has been a serial entrepreneur in life sciences. He's founded and built 3 innovative companies in the past 20 years, leading the last 2 of them through successful IPOs and billion-dollar trade deals. And then we have Bruce Friedrich, is the co-founder and executive director of Good Food Institute. GFI is a nonprofit organization that promotes innovative alternatives to industrial-produced animal products. At GFI, Bruce oversees all aspects of strategy and operations and ensures that the organization stays on mission. He's a very popular speaker at both academic audiences and the broader public at events like this. He's widely published, including his acclaimed book, Clean Protein. Today's moderator is Barbara Moran. Barbara is the senior producing editor for WBUR's environmental vertical. For more than 20 years, she has worked as a science journalist, is committed to covering issues of public health, environmental justice, and the intersection of science and society. So welcome to the panel.
This is the first event that there's been light outside. It's great. It's a sign of spring, I think. So thank you, everybody, for coming. I'll talk about climate change and food. This is going to be a great. I'm really fascinated by this topic. I wanted to kick it off with today's news, the big news of the day. Somebody give my picture. Where's my picture? My first picture. Ta-da! Right, the big news of the day, the announcement of the Impossible Whopper, which is being rolled out by Burger King, 59 restaurants in St. Louis. And if successful there, it can succeed anywhere, I guess, and they're going to roll it out nationwide. They're clear to say that this is not vegan. You can see the mayo plopped on it, so they're not doing this for the vegans. So I wanted you guys to talk about this as sort of, I don't know, is this like a cultural moment? Is this, I don't know, what does this symbolize? Is this the future? Is this what? A flash in the pan? Plastic grill. So tell me, comment on this. Tell me what does this represent, and is this going to be successful? Why don't we we'll just go down this way.
Yeah, I mean, for the thing that's so exciting, I think, about the Impossible Burger, which is also so exciting about the Beyond Burger, is that they look at their market sector as everybody, which I think is accentuated by the fact that the Beyond Burger has now launched at TGI Friday, nationally fastest national launch of a product at TGI Friday. They're also at Carl's Jr., also the fastest launch at Carl's Jr., also in A&Ws across Canada. Impossible is at White Castle. Now it's launching at Burger King. And these two companies in particular, and now they're bringing the sort of legacy plant-based meat companies with them, they see themselves as not products for vegetarians. They see themselves as products for meat eaters. So it really did used to be that the vegetarian products, and it was the waste product of carbohydrates in the case of wheat-based. It was the wheat protein. It was the waste product of soy oil in the case of the soy-based products. And it really was, what should we do with this stuff? Let's cram it together and force vegetarians to eat it. And if you're vegetarian and it sort of looks like meat, you might eat it. But if you're a meat eater and you really like the taste of meat, which the vast majority of people do, it didn't measure up. And I really liked the New York Times piece about this today, because the folks at Burger King, the folks who are the Whopper taster community at Burger King, they said they couldn't tell a difference. It was kind of fun to realize that they're paying people to be Whopper tasters. But and I do think, I think this is a part of the sort of shift from thinking about meat as coming from animals to thinking about everything in meat exists in plants. It's lipids, it's aminos, it's minerals, and water. You can biomimic meat with plants, and this is what that represents. And then, of course, you can also grow meat directly from cells. It's a new and better for the environment, better for global health way of making meat.
Oh, we'll get to that in a second. Air, so what is Burger King going to give Clover a run for its money?
I'm a funny one to be a wet blanket on this. We were Impossible's launch partner for New England, so we were the first place they sold in New England. And we were their most successful launch, and I think for our size, we still are. But the funny thing about this is because a lot of the menus they found themselves on so far, they've been a great choice if you're a vegetarian or vegan who finds yourself at a burger place with other meat eaters.
Yeah.
And at Clover, there's no meat on the menu, so it's sort of this odd inverse. You wouldn't think that selling it at the vegetarian restaurants where you actually sell it to a lot of meat eaters, but that's how it worked out. 90% of our customers eat meat normally, and then they come and they have no option on the menu except this is the closest thing to meat. So it's
give me something that looks like meat.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. So I think that's what they found at White Castle. It's been interesting. The big story with Impossible is probably if they get the price down, they will compete with meat, but. It's going to be hard for them to do that. I mean, there are a lot of this is sort of, I think, a quiet piece of this whole story is there are many, many layers of subsidies and other types of government programs that help support very, very low prices for animal protein. So I can buy milk. I can buy a gallon of milk at a quarter of the price of what I can buy oat milk. So oat milk is a handful of oats blended with water, and the gallon of milk has to be taken from a cow, and the gallon of milk costs a quarter of what the oat milk costs. And this is because there's just layers and layers and layers of different kinds of subsidies that help shape what our system is. And Impossible's not getting any of those, so I'm paying $12 a pound for the Impossible burger, which means I have to sell it for a lot. So I think it's exciting, but maybe not to get ahead of ourselves. I think it's maybe a little bit of what might be happening more in the future.
All right. What about you guys? Thoughts on the big rollout today?
It feels like one of many data points over the last 12 months or so that suggests that the idea of people caring about the sustainability and quality of their food is moving from just being a coastal elite issue to being a mainstream issue. What is more heartland than Burger King or We announced a collaboration with Budweiser a couple of weeks ago. Walmart has the Gigaton initiative to take a whole bunch of CO2 out of their supply chain. Kmart has sustainability initiatives. Like, increasingly, this feels like something that all brands care about, not just organic and coastal brands.
Yeah. Nicole, thoughts?
I think scale is sort of where the rubber hits the road in the food industry. And so my company is involved in supplying all these big global brands. And all of my customers need solutions that they can scale and that they can deliver in a consistent way at a consistent price point around the world. And so that's what's really interesting to me about this. Maybe it's the less sexy answer, but what's interesting to me about this is the supply chain solutions that have to be created in order to get this product to Burger King restaurants across the US. And then how can we think about bringing those same supply chain solutions to other kinds of products that consumers might want, but today can't get at these big chains, but can get at smaller, more regional chains or stores where they're being particularly catered to.
I want to talk a little bit more about meat in particular. It seems like whenever people talk about climate change or sustainability and food and the food choices we make, it always goes right to meat, especially beef. And I was wondering, can you guys talk a little bit about beef and beef production and why climate change talk often centers there? Once again, Nicole's smiling. She's like, no. Does that mean you want to take it or you don't want to take it?
Sure, no, I can take it because I actually have been involved in beef processing. So I was telling this fine gentleman, I'm sitting here with the red target on my back today. I used to run a slaughterhouse in Colorado, so one of the world's largest slaughterhouses, so I can speak directly to what that's like. It's real. We really do have a responsibility to address the environmental consequences of meat production in the world. And the industry has struggled to address them and has struggled for a long time. When others knew what the problems were and were speaking about what the problems were in the industry, didn't want to hear it. So a lot of work is being done now to try to make change in the way we raise animals around the world and the way we bring meat to market and to address the meat that most of the people in this world eat.
Can you? I just want to back up, make sure everybody's on the same page. It's like, can somebody give me some numbers or some sort of stats about why is beef or meat so much more resource intensive than other, I don't know, pork?
I mean, just think about the physiology of animals. So animals like we have to eat, animals also have to eat. So chicken is the most efficient meat, and according to the World Resources Institute, it takes 9 calories into a chicken in the form of corn and wheat and oats and other crops. It takes 9 calories into a chicken to get 1 calorie back out. So that's 8 times as much land. It's 8 times as many, 8 times as many energy inputs, 8 times as much water, 8 times as much energy to run the combines. And then you're shipping that grain to a feed mill and you're operating a feed mill. And then you're shipping the feed to the farm and you're operating the farm. Then you're shipping the animals to the slaughterhouse and you're operating the slaughterhouse. Once you crunch all of those numbers, the difference between growing crops and processing it into meat, as opposed to growing crops and putting it through all of those stages and far more crops. Beef is the most intensive, but it's also true that, not a lot, but some cattle eat grains that people wouldn't eat. Some cattle, could do cattle exclusively in a sort of rotating way that is actually carbon capture. I know Nicole's looking into this. So, but all of the animals, it's not good.
Yeah, Bruce, we should take a moment and just land on that issue for a second, because what Bruce has said is true, and I don't disagree with you. So I think you raised excellent points. One of the things that that it's important to remember about cattle and ruminants in general is that they consume foods that can't be useful for humans. So we can't turn grass into useful fuel for our bodies, but they can. And all cattle here in North America spend the majority of their lives on grass. So they're out there in Colorado. If any of you have spent any time in the center of the country, there's a lot of land out there that you can't grow broccoli on, and that you don't want to irrigate, and you don't want to grow crops on. But it grows really kind of low quality vegetation or grasses, and cattle can turn that into really high quality protein. And then from there, most cattle in North America will end up in a feedlot where they're finished on grain, which is, to Bruce's point, where they're being fed those supplements to get them to market.
But don't be mistaken. You can eat vegetables, and you can eat beef, but the difference in those diets and the carbon footprint is like 20x. I mean, it's not minor. It's massive. And for most people sitting in this audience today, if you care about the environment and you think of yourself as an activist or maybe a quiet activist, the biggest thing you can probably go do tomorrow, if you are an engineer and you line up the impact of all the different choices you can make tomorrow, probably the biggest thing you can do is take meat off your plate, even if you do it for 1 or 2 meals of the day.
Oh, Air, do you really believe that's more important than the transportation choices we're making?
I don't think that anybody here can make a transportation decision tomorrow that's going to have a bigger impact than stopping eating meat tomorrow.
The thing is, I mean,
and it's not a point of opinion. I mean, there's a lot of fact on this, and I can understand why you might be responsible
on that
to.
Point, but
you might be responsible to share a very different point of view. But
yeah.
I'd suggest to anybody who's curious about this, there's a lot of publicly available information on this that doesn't sound like that. I think that you can look at it and most people can figure out there's a lot available now. There didn't used to be. I mean, this is changing. The information is like tremendous. And 10 years ago, this sounded like totally shocking to me. I mean, that was a part of what got me doing what I'm doing. I thought I cared a lot about environmental issues, but I never thought of food as being an environmental issue. And it's awesome. Now we're here and there's a whole bunch of people gathered around to listen about it. But I do think that the information about it is new. And if it's something that you are curious about, I encourage everybody to go and read up on it.
Yeah, the journal Nature crunched the precise numbers, and chicken is the most efficient meat. It's also the least climate change inducing meat. And yet per calorie of protein, if you're going to eat legumes, that does, it's 4,000% more climate change from chicken, 40 times as much climate change per calorie of protein when compared to things like soy and peas, which are the predominant ingredients in plant-based meat.
Nicole?
Well, I mean, I don't disagree with the fact that meat definitely has environmental implications and that we need to think hard about what we eat. But I do want to caution us. I think there's sort of this easy answer idea out there that I can just swap one really great delicious food for a different really great delicious food and I'll have done my part for climate change. And I don't think that's the case. So I am a bit worried that we're really, really focusing on let's cut meat out of our diet and let's save the world. That's a little bit, I'm a seller of food. I'm agnostic at what kind of food people want to buy. If people want to buy broccoli burgers or whatever, I'm good with that because I can find a way to make them for them and sell them. But we have to do a lot more than just swap out a really great burger for a really great burger. We have to think harder about the rest of our lives, not just the food on our plate at lunch.
Okay. Everybody's like, okay, everybody okay?
Oh, Barbara, this isn't even.
We haven't even get started. All right. Let's back off of meat for a minute, because I'm sure we can answer questions from the audience who will have questions. But because so much of the climate change conversation focuses on meat and beef, what about other stuff in the food supply chain that are sort of resource heavy, like, I don't know, corn, sugar, rice? Can you guys talk to that a little bit? And are there changes to be made there, either sort of on a production level or on a consumer level? Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, just starting with stats again. So agriculture, as the whole industry, emits somewhere between 25 and 35% of the total human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a big contributor. And there's other stuff. So we're using
in like fertilizer or in tractors and stuff, or where does the greenhouse emission coming?
All of that. So we use, for the last 50 plus years, we've become really dependent on chemical fertilizers, which cause multiple problems. They take a lot of energy to create, and then a good portion of what we apply on the ground ends up in the atmosphere in the form of NOx and other potent greenhouse gases. And then some of the remainder runs off into streams and rivers, which causes algae blooms in lakes and dead zones in rivers, dead zones in oceans. And then there's the diesel in the tractor, and you can sort of go on down the list. So I think that number also includes animal emissions. So whatever the emissions associated with producing animal proteins is incorporated into that. And that the modern method of agriculture also creates the nitrogen runoff problems I talked about, the pesticide residue on our food, the lack of or loss of carbon sequestration in the ground. And so, yeah, I think we could safely say that if we're going to increase our production capacity to feed a growing population, we've got to do that while also swapping out a lot of the methods that we're using today.
What's a particularly, I don't want to insult any grain, but what's a particularly resource intensive grain? Like, is that like rice, sugar, or what?
I think
what
no
is it?
grains are represented here. So we're safe.
I'm going to get trolled on Twitter by the rice lovers of America.
Well, corn is most often brought up because
Okay.
it requires so much nitrogen fertilizer if it's grown through conventional ways.
Okay.
And
so-
then a lot of corn doesn't get eaten directly. Most of it either goes to animal food or to ethanol, which in some ways compounds the problem.
So is
Yeah,
this?
I do feel like I should just point out that everything he's talking about with regard to growing crops and the fertilizer and the runoff, then it goes back to 9 calories in for 1 calorie back out. So, I mean, Nicole and I, my main point on beef is that beef is not necessarily the worst, and beef is the one meat that if the regenerative agriculture thing works, it ends up being the least bad. Chicken and pork and turkey, it's just the nature of animal physiology that the vast majority of the corn globally is fed to farm animals. And all of the runoff he's talking about, it's much, much worse if you're creating all of that grain to feed it to farm animals so that we can eat animals, so that we can eat meat. And I mean, it's not the whole solution to the problem, eating less meat, but it's a move in the right direction, along with moving toward more regeneratively farmed, especially cattle.
Yeah, and I wonder, is it okay, can we talk a little bit about soil health?
Yeah, and I also want to get to the question. How do you break that chain? At what point is that chain best broken? But yeah, go ahead. So talk about, is the solution just raising animals differently so there's no corn in the process, or what?
Well, let's just talk for a minute and just kind of get everybody grounded in the same place on the potential for soil or the important role soil plays as a carbon sink. And so will you help me a little bit on that one, Bruce?
I'll give it a try.
David too. So a healthy soil, supports sort of a diverse ecosystem, right? You all know that the bugs live in the soil, and if the soil's healthy, you get the birds and the flora and the fauna and the whole thing. And if you have healthy soil, it is sucking carbon into the soil, and it's storing that carbon for us in the soil. So it's acting as sort of the filter for our environment. And what we do in agriculture messes that up sometimes. Or what we do in agriculture can actually encourage healthier soils. So proper grazing techniques for cattle, and we're doing a lot of work to try and understand exactly what that looks like, can actually increase the health of the soil versus if you didn't have any big animals living on that soil. But there are other...
So the soil would actually be healthier with animals on it, as you're saying?
Soil that is worked by the animal can be healthier than soil that is not worked. So we call that fallow. If you leave the ground fallow and just don't do anything with it, it actually doesn't get healthier. It works better if you have big, heavy ruminant animals doing all the things they do on the soil and chewing the grasses, and it's called part of a regenerative ecosystem. And now I'm going to leave it to the smart fellows over here.
Oh,
I mean,
shoot.
David's
I thought I
raising-
was going to go.
Yeah. One of these smart
Now we're
fellows.
right in David's life.
So the stats on this are really encouraging. Actually, perhaps the most optimistic thing I know of with regard to climate change is the potential for agricultural soils to sequester carbon. So I know that's a remarkable statement, but today's agricultural soils contain about 1% carbon. Virgin soils, so prairie or forest, whatever they were before we started cultivating, were probably around 3 to 7. And if we took every cultivated acre on the planet and got it back from 1% to 3%, all of that carbon comes out of the atmosphere. So that's what plants do, is turn CO2 into other carbon structures. The amount of carbon that would be sequestered in that soil, going from 1 to 3%, is roughly the same amount that's been emitted by humans since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It's a gigantic potential sink, and one that's sort of poorly understood today.
And
If we can create the right incentives for farmers to adopt the practices that increase carbon soil sequestration, we can have a real impact on the environment and turn agriculture into from one of the culprits into one of the saviors.
And this is one of the reasons that plant-based meat and clean meat grown directly from cells, are so exciting. They require 99% less land than meat that includes animals, 99% less land. And there are ways of doing carbon sequestration that include grazing ruminants, but there are other ways to do carbon sequestration. So you can come up with products, the meat that everybody loves, so it's meat from plants that's indistinguishable in terms of taste, or it's meat grown directly from cells, which is literally indistinguishable because it's the exact same thing. Then you have all of this land that can be repurposed from growing massive amounts of crops and dumping massive amounts of nitrogen fertilizer onto them to various forms of carbon sequestration, including what Nicole is talking about. You could graze large ruminants on it in a regenerative way. The problem with, it's fairly hypothetical, the idea of regenerative agriculture working from a carbon sequestration standpoint, because the vast majority of cattle today are still finished, and so they are still fed grains. But you could have regenerative systems where they weren't fed grains, and that would be a move in the right direction in a big way from a climate change vantage.
Yeah.
What we're trying to encourage right now is, at least here in the U.S., I'm not anti-grain finishing. I actually think there are some real climate benefits for grain finishing, because it finishes the animals more quickly, and so the animals' methane emissions over its life are actually shorter because it doesn't live as long. And so the methane emissions to produce that pound of beef are actually shorter. However, that being said, we have an opportunity here in North America, where we do grain finish almost all of the cattle, to improve at least all of that time that they're grazing, and improve the grazing practices if we work with America's beef farmers to try and understand what their challenges are and what kind of data they require in order to make changes, and how we can help them do that. It's real.
And presumably improve the methods by which the grain that they're fed is grown.
For sure, but I look to you for that, my friend.
Okay.
So let me ask. So there seems like coming at this the climate change issue via food and food production. There's a lot of different ways to come at it. So what I feel like, how will these changes? You touched on this before, but it's about these government subsidies. So what are there government policies that should be put in place to help achieve some of these new ways of looking at food production, and at what level and what policies? What do you guys think should be happening that isn't, or is happening but too slowly? You're all nodding. You all have a favorite. Yeah.
I have a point of view. There's two ways to influence agriculture and farmers. One's through regulation, and the other's through incentives. Farmers are notoriously hard to regulate. Every generalization is wrong, but if you were going to make one about farmers, they're fiercely independent, and they're super diverse and spread across a lot of area. They're very hard to sort of regulate effectively. But they're also, every one is a small business person. Like they understand incentives very well, and we have the opportunity to provide an incentive for farmers to farm in ways that are consistent with what those of us who think of, who hold the common good value. So greater carbon sequestration, less carbon emissions, less nitrogen runoff. So things like paying per ton of CO2 sequestration in the soil is very doable at a cost that is around $20 a ton, much lower than any other sort of CO2 extraction from the atmosphere technology that I know of.
One thing that GFI has opened in India, Israel, Brazil, China, Europe, and our focus internationally, and the focus of our policy department in the United States, is to convince the government to put some of its research, the governments in the United States and around the world, to put some of their R&D money into perfecting the technology of plant-based meat and accelerating the technology and helping to scale up the clean meat, because these are the solution to a lot of problems that governments recognize that they have. They don't require antibiotics, and that is a huge global health scourge. they have a fraction of the climate impact, a fraction of the water pollution, a fraction of the water use, much better food security, less food poisoning. So governments are putting tens of billions of dollars into R&D focused on global health and environmental initiatives. They should be putting some of that money into basically laying the groundwork of the science for plant-based meat and clean meat from which all of these companies can grow and scale up. That's one of the things that we're working on that we think really should be happening more at a policy level. Singapore just put tens of millions of dollars into these alternative technologies, and we'd like to see China and Israel and India and the US and other governments.
I'm glad the US slipped in there, right?
But I would bring something else to this conversation. For one, I think the idea of I think that the idea that the beef that we eat is going to be a regenerative agriculture, it's a bit of a fairy tale. I mean, if you crunch the numbers on it, I just don't think that's going to come out. But on this question of subsidies, there are a lot of subsidies in place right now. You could talk about additional incentives, but what about what we're spending money on right now? I mean, how big was the Farm Bill? Right, we spend an enormous amount of our GDP supporting the actions that happen right now. The U.S. has a giant surplus of meat right now. They're having trouble figuring out where to put it because there's a certain shelf life on freezing it, and the freezers are all full. Why do we have all this extra meat right now? Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Well, that's a complicated question, but we'll sell it all. I mean, there is sort of always we're in a net demand state.
But how is the
global
excess right now that we're having trouble storing? How is that related to subsidies?
I'm not sure I know what you mean.
Well, there's a giant excess right now in meat products and also in dairy products, and it's a result of money that is our money, taxpayer money, that is being directed to overproduction. Some of this is related to trade issues that are going on right now, but there are a lot of facts, coming out. But I think I'm not the one to represent, the sort of global politics side of this. But I do think that it's, it's important we don't paint these fairy tales, and that's happening right now. That's the reality. So there's a lot of money that is being collected from all of us in our taxes and is being redirected through the Farm Bill and in other means to shape the farming ecosystem. And I think that I love the idea of, attracting people to nice things, but I also think we could all rethink where we're putting our money, and we could probably get some different results.
Let me just on that segue into the consumer side of it, right? Because it's a push and pull, right? Sort of the top-down government policies are influenced by what consumers and voters and taxpayers are doing and asking for. So what are the hurdles or challenges with getting people to, adopt more sustainable diets in any way, however you define that? So what do you see in your?
Well, one challenge is confusion. I think that there are a lot of people who read Michael Pollan's book and read eat mostly plants, and then are eating a salad with 4 ounces or 6 ounces of steak on it. That's not mostly plants, even though most of your plate is green. It's not what he intended. So I do think that there's a lot of confusion, and I think that we're at a really interesting moment, right? Like I said, 10 years ago, I don't think there was much knowledge out there. Now there's starting to be some knowledge out there, and I think there's we see a lot of change afoot, and with that, there's going to be interests, on both sides that are sort of competing for people's minds and what people look at and believe in. So I think that there's a deliberate amount of confusion being added to the conversation right now about meat and what I should eat, and it's interesting. We work with customers every day, and everybody wants to know how to make a good choice, whether it's nutritionally speaking or, for their environment. And it's really hard to know that about food right now. This is a really dishonest industry.
Is that true? Do people actually make choices based on what's good for the environment, or, right? Is that actually how people choose what to eat? I know that we talked about this.
Yeah, not by and large. It's interesting. It's the fact that you ask somebody, how much do you incorporate animal welfare concern or environmental concern or health concern? how much do you incorporate that into what you're eating? And people will tell the pollsters that it's critically important to them. But then they've now done this study 3 times where they ask people whether they think food with DNA in it should be labeled. And all 3 times.
That is not true.
No, it's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. They've done it 3 times, and it was over 80% all 3 times. People want food with DNA in it labeled, and obviously nobody's like going to the grocery store to look for food with DNA. So it's absurd. And people will. I mean, they did a study at the Stanford Dining Hall where they labeled food, and they labeled it heart healthy. They labeled it low cholesterol, low carb. They labeled it delicious, and they put no label on it. And the more healthy you made it sound, the less it sold. When there's something programmed in our brains. This is the base of Maslow's hierarchy, physiology. When we are choosing what to eat, we are hardwired to go with something that's caloric and something that's delicious. And I think one of the exciting things about designing meat in a different way is it doesn't require people to think about the product differently. Like the polls when polls are done and what people are actually buying is analyzed, it's price, it's taste, and it's convenience.
In that order, or does it shift depending on the?
Those are definitely the top 3. And when they do weighted polls where you get extra credit for being first and less credit for being down at the bottom, the only thing that even hits 0 that's not price, taste, and convenience is health. But health is right at 0, and everything else, including things like environmental concerns and animal protection concerns, are like sort of down here. So there are early adopter audiences who will buy on the basis of something other than price, taste, and convenience. But I'll bet even at Clover, like the food is flipping delicious, and it's fun, and it's interesting, and it's a great atmosphere. Like people are, it's nice that it's also healthier, but I suspect that most people are going there because it's an awesome restaurant.
Do you think does the price come into play more with sort of sustainable food? I mean, does it end up being, is this like an equity issue with people who want to eat, at Clover, or but don't because it's it's too expensive? I don't know. How do you address that, or do you, I don't know. I wonder if that ever comes into play in these conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. For most people, the primary decision is around price. We look at as value, which can mean a lot of different things to people, and convenience. But it doesn't mean those are the only things that people are taking into account. And there's a reason Dunkin' Donuts getting rid of the styrofoam cups. There's a reason that Starbucks is trying to make compostable packaging. I mean, they're not doing those things it's a lot more expensive. I can tell you that. And
what is making the different?
The styrofoam cup is great for Dunkin's bottom line, but their customers are wanting them to move away from that, right? So, of course. And I would say, from the study of the signage, it, I think, speaks to broader confusion. And a lot of people that might stay away from the sign that says healthy is probably related less to their fact that they want to eat unhealthy food, and probably more to the fact that when they've eaten food in the past that's labeled healthy, it's tasted awful, right?
Right, that goes back to those veggie burger
Yeah.
leftover things you were talking about at the beginning.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. It's because they see healthy and they think, I'm going to sacrifice taste. The point is just that taste is the driver.
Yeah, I think that, those 3 things matter, and different people care about different things. Some people will go across town for something that's really cheap and doesn't taste very good, but it doesn't. But they, that's how they're motivated. And some people will go across town for something that's very expensive but tastes so great. So people are different.
And there are certainly early adopters who will pay more for food. There are early adopters who will try things because it's like new and exciting and interesting. But you're not going to break into the mainstream unless you can compete on the basis of price, taste, and convenience.
Yeah. Something else we haven't talked about in the sort of whole food flow is the packaging question as well as the food waste question. And are those even, how do those factor into the climate change question? Are they even, are they factors? I mean, I'm sure they're factors, but are they as much factors as the sort of production and the supply chain and all that? Do you guys want to comment on that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, so if the estimates for waste in the supply chain are 30+%. So that's
in the production of any
that's an average from growing it through consuming it. So it includes waste in the field, waste in transportation, and waste in the home. That varies a lot depending on what it is. So you don't have a lot of waste in wheat flour, and you have a lot of waste in bananas. for obvious reasons that bananas have a lower shelf life.
More banana bread.
Yeah, banana pudding, smoothies.
Right, it's going to solve everything.
Yeah.
We've figured it out.
There are, I mean, some of this is just valuing the problem. So to the extent that we're willing to pay to reduce waste, there's all sorts of solutions to that. There are a couple of really interesting technologies and companies that are working on them that use natural coatings for produce to extend their shelf life. There's a company in California called Appeal Sciences that uses a plant extract to cover, fruits and vegetables, and the results are amazing. So, I think that there's a hope there on both the technology side and the process side.
I think it's important that we don't ask consumers to solve these problems for businesses. So we can't ask a consumer, will you pay more if I address this animal welfare problem in my supply chain, or if I don't, right? That is an unfair burden to place on the consumer, and in part because we kind of know the result of that. They're probably not going to help us solve our problems. So each of us needs to, as part of our own corporate social responsibility and our contract with society, we need to figure out what our own issues are and get after fixing them, and get after fixing them in a way that that is efficient and that leverages innovation and that delivers something to our consumers that they want and need. But I'm not looking to consumers to tell me, should I or should I not address an antibiotics overuse issue in my supply chain. I need to address that as a good corporate citizen. And I think that, that goes to, because I always get this question, particularly when I go around and I'm working with beef producers around the world, and they always want to talk to me about whether they're going to get a premium on their product if they adopt a particular practice in their business. And the answer is typically no, you're not. As we evolve and as our expectations evolve and as our communities change their contract with us, we are going to be asked to do things differently, and that's just life, and that's you're going to have to find a way to make money anyway.
Although, I mean, it is the case, I guess back a little bit to something Air said earlier, that you look at like Michael Pollan when he's talking about eat less meat, eat food, mostly plants. What was the third part of that?
Eat
Not
less
too much.
food. Not too much,
mostly plants. When he's talking about eat less meat, he's talking about a fraction of what people are eating now. And you look at groups like Farm Forward, which works on regenerative agriculture, or the folks at Dr. Bronner's who are real pioneers in regenerative agriculture. They do think that even if we repurposed all of the land into sort of regenerative farming, again, it's just ruminants, and it's everybody eating a tiny fraction of the amount of meat that they're eating now. So, and they will get significant premiums. People who actually move to regenerative agriculture can charge 3 times as much for their beef, and they will have a line of people willing to pay it. So if you're sort of tinkering around to the edges, you're not going to get more for using slightly fewer antibiotics. But if you go high welfare, antibiotic-free, regenerative, farmers will make huge premiums for that.
Sure, Bruce, but my view on this. Then that's great, and that should happen, and any farmer who wants to do that should do it, and I will help him or her do it in every way I can. And then we need to address the other 99.9% of the food that people are eating. So we can't just fix the food that the wealthy get to eat.
Well, that's where plant-based and clean meat come in.
Or you take some of the subsidies away from the animal proteins, and you'll see prices change a lot in the marketplace. I mean, that's just the truth. I'm getting sort of looks away when I say that, but it's the reality. I mean, these are the numbers. You can look at how much money we spend of our tax dollars every year supporting the agriculture that's in the way it is right now. I think that if we made some changes, you would see prices change a lot. And it's hard because right now I buy, right now I'm about to sell spring dug parsnips. So I buy that from a farmer back in Western Mass. And parsnips are the first plant that can come out of the ground here in New England. It's a really cool thing. You can leave them in over the winter, and then you can pull them as soon as the ground gets soft. And people didn't used to do that because it wasn't worth doing. People used to do it a long time ago, and then they stopped doing it. And some farmers have started redoing it. And when they pull them early, they're like candy. It's awesome. They need to convert a lot of their starches to sugar to keep from dying over the winter. But those spring dug parsnips, that farmer's got to sell them to me at like a big premium, and I've got to figure out how to get them to customers and make them excited enough that you all want to spend the money on them. And meanwhile, I can buy, if I wanted to, I could buy pork or beef at really, really low prices. And it's a reality, it's a very different playing field for farmers that are doing things in different ways. And the playing field is not stacked toward the people that are pursuing regenerative agriculture and those kind of practices that would benefit us all. So I think there's an opportunity to look at all of this.
One other thing to toss out on the policy front that I think plays on what you're just saying is the amount of lowest common denominator chicken, pork, and beef that the government actually buys. I ran a homeless shelter and a soup kitchen in Washington, D.C. for 6 years, the largest soup kitchen in Washington, D.C. We had literally unlimited chicken, pork, beef, milk, a few other things as well, but it was because the government, when prices went down, it's not just the subsidies, it's also massive buying programs, and then they just sort of, shelters and prisons, as much meat as, the inmates and and people in the shelters can possibly consume.
Which is probably by some people seen as a positive thing.
Right? We didn't get a lot of complaints in the soup line, but I mean we do have like unhealthy. Our inmate population is incredibly unhealthy, and the healthcare costs of that are astronomical. We have obese homeless people, which is sort of an odd thing. We have because of, it's also sort of the cheap processed foods in the food deserts, but it's also people on soup lines. Oftentimes they're like incredibly overweight because they basically, if they come for the soup line, they can eat, as much beef, pork, and chicken as they want.
Yeah.
I do want to just interject a little bit and say, could we all please just find a little love in our hearts for the American farmer who may be imperfect and may be benefiting from an imperfect system, but who have delivered us a food secure society where I don't need to worry about whether or not my kids have enough food for dinner tonight. And a secure country in that way, right? Food security is tied to national security in so many important ways. The average American farmer is not a big risk taker. They are gambling with their homes and their family's wealth. Unlike me, I work for a corporation. If I make a stupid decision, my boss, maybe he'll fire me. He probably won't. He'll probably forgive me if I lose some of his money. But I'm not probably going to lose my house because I made a bad choice. And farmers deal with that every day. The debt to equity ratio on the average American farm is astonishing. These are people whose wealth is all tied up in land. They have no cash, right? They're quite cash poor. And so they're highly leveraged. Their wealth is all in land. It's not easily liquidated, and they can't do other things quite simply. So we have constructed a system to encourage them to do things that I would say are sure bets. And they have figured out how to make that work for them, by and large, and they're doing that. If we want them to do something different, we have to help them get there, and we have to acknowledge it's not going to happen fast, and we have to allow them a little bit more support as they make these changes. That's the way our farm system works. These are not corporate fat cats who draw salaries. These are families sitting around the dinner table trying to decide what to plant next year and how to fertilize the soil.
I agree. We can hold both of these things to be true, that farmers are not making any money and we need to change the subsidy system. So according to the USDA, the average farmer in 2018 lost $1,500 over the year. And that was before they paid themselves a salary or did anything else. So, farmers are not wealthy, and the subsidy system is necessary in order to assure our food security. It does do some weird stuff, like as you were talking about, it incentivizes farmers to plant things that get insurance, et cetera, that aren't necessarily healthiest for us as consumers. So there's real opportunity for change in how those incentives are structured, including towards incentivizing more regenerative practices, but doesn't mean that money is going to the wrong place.
Yeah, we could also, farm consolidation has obviously gone, what is it, 2% of people in agriculture now? Down from, 100 years ago, like 80%?
That's not a farm consolidation issue.
Yeah.
Not a farm consolidation
Well, I'm talking
issue.
about
That's
the farmers
a
that you're talking
productivity
about. So, I mean, the subsidy system is definitely bad for them also. It's not just bad for our health, it's not just bad for our environment, it's also bad for farmers. The solution to that isn't to, like, sort of hold up the farmers and say changes will help them. If we could create a system where they're growing crops that they don't have to monocrop, where they're incentivized to grow crops that don't require the massive nitrogen load, where they're incentivized to grow crops not to feed to chickens and pigs and cows, but to feed to human beings, healthier crops that the government would then buy and feed to healthier prisoners and healthier homeless population and healthier school lunches. Like, the solution would be inclusive of the farmers if we shifted the system in a way that's better for farmers. I mean, it's awful that we are the breadbasket of the world and farmers are struggling in the way that you are describing. So the subsidies, I mean, they're helping somebody, but they're clearly not helping the farmers.
I want to ask you each one last question, then we'll open it up to the audience, which I'm sure is anxious to ask you all a lot of questions. I was thinking as we were talking, like, how this conversation would be different if we had it 30 years from now. So, 20, 50, 30 years from now, and we all come back. No, we're super healthy for eating all that lentils and stuff and exercising. So, we come back 30 years from now and, revisit this topic. How has the conversation changed, do you think? What are we going to be talking about then? What are the choices we're going to be thinking about then? We'll go. Why don't we start with Nicole and go this way? All right.
Do I have to eat the lentils? I just I can't.
I'll make some for you. You're going to love them.
They're going to have parsnips.
Beluga lentil
They're like
salad.
Sugar.
You're going to dream about.
I will eat that clover food all day long,
All right.
I tell you. Yeah, I think we'll definitely be in a different place on animal agriculture for sure. We certainly see an evolving culture around expectations around animal agriculture. Back when I was a kid, a really long time ago, we sort of had a trust me kind of a relationship with consumers, and we said, you don't need to know how we make meat, and you probably don't wanna, and I'm not gonna bother you with the details, just trust me, it's all fine, and we're gonna be good. And we've sort of moved now into a stage where we're trying out transparency, and we're trying to show people about the choices we make and why we make them, and help people understand why we follow the practices we follow, and then receiving feedback on those practices. But I think in the future, we will have a far more transparent relationship with consumers, and we will be far more responsive to consumer feedback on our practices. So I would just ask any of you, do any of you follow a big farmer on social media? So not like a little local one, but like a big one. Okay, so I would recommend, that is my PSA for farmers today, is just find one that you like. I have a friend of mine who has a blog, Kids, Cows, and Grass or something. Her name is Debbie Lyons Blythe. She's quite active on social media, but you can find a million of them. And these American farmers are desperately trying to talk with you about what they're doing. They so want to tell you about what they're doing, and also they are welcoming your feedback on their practices. But they really don't think anyone cares what they have to say. And so they're talking out there. I promise you they're talking, and no one's listening to them. So please listen to them. And then, engage with them and come back and say, you know what, this thing that you told me you're doing because you think it's in the best interest of the pigs, I don't like that. That offends me, and that offends my cultural values. And so I need to share that information with you. And they'll say, oh, okay. All right, that's the kind of thing that has to happen in order to get us where we need to be, which is that sort of transparency between us.
All right. David, all right, 30 years in the future.
So I think we today are at a watershed moment with regard to climate. I think in a single generation, we've created a crisis, and we've got probably less than a generation to fix it if we're going to. And I don't think we can overreact to this problem. And I'm an optimist, so I'll say 30 years from now, we have solved it, and we've solved it by realizing that everything starts with food. Like, we are literally what we eat, and that includes how that food was grown, what choices we make, how much of it we eat. It's the solution both to our own personal health and to the planet's health. And if we're going to have a good meeting in 30 years, we need to figure that out soon.
I love it. Fantastic. All right.
I think we're living in the
Aaron,
same
you're
world.
catering the meal. In 30 years
Yeah.
we get back.
Agreed.
I have a lot of optimism. I think would echo probably both those things. 30 years from now, the people that are 20 are going to be 50, and we're going to have an unprecedented level of transparency, right? I think that the food industry, it really is like the most dishonest industry there is. If you think about honesty between what people understand and what the reality is, it's crazy. My background, I was a scientist at MIT, and I ran research labs for a while, and then I went to business school and I worked at global 100 companies, really big companies. And I didn't know much about the food industry before I got into it. And I have to tell you, like, the past 10 years has been this big education. I keep learning things like, wow, I didn't know that. And I change what I do. And then I meet CEOs of other companies like Ron Shaich, who built Panera and Au Bon Pain, and he's a vegan. And I'm like, what are you doing? And the guy who ran Stop and Shop is also a vegan. And it's really interesting as you learn more and more, you start changing what you do. And I think what's going to happen is in the future, it's not just going to be those privileged few who have that information and the insiders. I think everybody's going to have more information, and I'm excited about what that's going to lead us to.
All right, and Bruce.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with David that climate change is an existential crisis. I think antibiotic-resistant superbugs are an even greater existential crisis. I think if we stay on our current trajectory, we're going to need 70% more meat by 2050. I've been vegan for more than 30 years, so I'm a big fan of individual action, but I think these are planetary crises, and we are not going to convince most people to eat less meat. We're not going to solve this problem unless we give people these alternatives. And I think by necessity, we are going to see more governments following in Singapore's footsteps. Israel's going to do it, India's going to do it, China's going to do it, the US is going to do it. And we're going to replace meat with plants and meat with meat that's grown from cells rather than grown from animals. Pat Brown, who founded Impossible Foods, he said, he believes and preaches everywhere that by 2035, 100% of meat is going to be plant-based because we will be giving people exactly what they like about meat, the taste, the texture, and so on, but it will cost less. I'm less optimistic about plants. I think there are a lot of people who want to eat actual animal meat, but I don't think there are that many people who are excited about raising and slaughtering animals. So if we can charge less and serve a healthier product that's grown directly from cells, I think we'll be very close to 100%. I think probably there will be more regenerative agriculture than there is right now. Nicole says, it's less than 1/10 of 1% that's purely regenerative. I think people like Michael Pollan and Alice Waters and other people really do want sort of circle of life meat. So there'll be more of that, but it'll still be probably less than, probably 99% fewer animals, 99% less meat produced from live animals than is produced now. Probably quicker than 30 years.
Wow. All right. Well, we shall see. All right. We have a date. We'll set the date now. We'll put it on our calendars for 30 years and come back. Great. All right. Let's open it up to the audience for questions. And there's going to be something that comes up here that's going to work. Oh, look at that. Ta-da! All right. Look at this. All right. From Ian. How much are the speakers worried about or thinking about water shortages? Good question, especially in important agriculture areas like the Midwest and California, right? We didn't talk about water. Oh, look, he has an answer. David.
All right, stats again. So as a planet, we are currently consuming about 30% more fresh water than we can replenish. So we hold fresh water in above ground lakes, and everybody can see those, but most of the water exists in aquifers and big storage areas under the ground. When we draw down a lake, everybody knows that's a problem, but those levels can also be replenished by heavy rains and snowfall and so forth. Aquifers take a lot longer. Depends on the geology, but maybe 1,000 years. We don't really have the option of drawing those down and then waiting for a big rainfall to replenish them. They'll be done for all intents and purposes. So 30% more water is being drawn down each year than is being replenished, and about 70% of that water is used by agriculture. So you can't address the water issue without addressing agriculture.
That's a U.S. statistic, right?
That is a worldwide statistic.
That's a worldwide statistic.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a little better than that in the U.S., but
Yeah, that's what I thought.
because our irrigation methods are a little more efficient. But it's another completely solvable problem with the right incentives. We do spray irrigation, so we spray water up in the air, and some of it lands on the soil and goes where we want, and some of it evaporates and runs off. If we valued water, we would irrigate differently. We would irrigate different crops. We would grow different crops in different areas. I'm an optimist, and it's hard for me to be optimistic on this. Until we start valuing water fundamentally differently, which has to be done, I think, at a federal government level at least, we're not going to solve this. Nobody is going to treat water as a precious resource if it's free. Mm-hmm. And I would put it behind climate change, but just behind.
Mm-hmm. The United Nations released a report some years ago called Livestock's Long Shadow. And it looked at all of the inefficiency that I was talking about earlier, and it said no matter what environmental issue you look at, from the largest and most global to the smallest and most local, every single one, raising animals for food is one of the top 3 contributors. And obviously, water use is a part of that. I mean, just the basics of if you have to use 9 times as much land, you need 9 times as much water. But the farm is also incredibly water intensive. The slaughterhouse is incredibly water intensive. So again, if we're creating meat from plants and growing it directly from cells, that's a fraction of the amount of water. And that's one of the specific issues that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation flagged when they said that they see cell-based meat, growing meat directly from cells, as a part of the solution to global hunger, the 800 million people who are living in nutritional deficit, and doing that without the same adverse climate impact and without the threat of literal water wars from water scarcity.
Yeah. Let's go to Anonymous. Mm-hmm. I know you're out there, Anonymous. Where are you? All right, food portions and food waste. We talked about a little bit this in the supply chain, but maybe talk about it in individual levels. Food portions and food waste, 40% are major issues at the intersection of food and climate. Discuss. Smiley face. Thank you, Anonymous, for that smiley face. All right. Anything else we want to talk about other than with food waste, other than
one
smoothies and banana bread?
Yeah, just one thing to toss out. So at the Good Food Institute, we work primarily on changing the way that meat, dairy, and eggs are created to biomimic with plants and to use cellular agriculture to create the real thing. There's a phenomenal nonprofit organization that's working with Walmart and Target and Kroger and Safeway and other companies called ReFed. I'm pretty sure they're just refed.org online, but they also have white papers and really just powerful reports, both about the issue and then also about what individuals can do. This is another one where individual action is great, but we're not going to solve it with individual action. So people who have the power of running corporations and people who can make change at the government level and incentivize less waste. And they have a lot of ideas on their website and are doing terrific work.
I think there's a lot of waste in restaurants.
I was just going to ask, if you could weigh in on that.
And even more at home in your own refrigerator. I mean, it's still uncomfortable, but it's true. This is an area where I'm really optimistic about technology's role. There are a lot of things that we can do with technology, and it's probably going to work its way down. But a lot of restaurateurs right now are trying to figure out how to reduce their waste, and there's a lot of clever ideas and things that people are trying out to do it.
Are you doing anything innovative at Clover for this?
Yeah, we're different in a lot of ways. I mean, we still have a good amount of waste, but we don't freeze anything at Clover. It's sort of a just-in-time kind of delivery system. So we receive things, we make it, we sell it. Most things we hold for less than 24 hours, so we don't have much waste at the end of the day. But that said, there's still opportunities we find. And the great thing for restaurants is if technology and information sharing and a lot of things that are developing that didn't used to be around. I mean, I can just look at my business. 8 years ago, I was sort of on my own on this kind of thing. And now I have the support of companies that are building tech tools. There's a cool company that built a scale that goes underneath your trash can, and when you go to throw something in the trash can in the restaurant, you tap a little screen to say what it is you're throwing away, and it just keeps track of that. And
just to give you guilt?
No, because I'm the CEO of the company. I can look at how many thousands of pounds of whatever was thrown away, and if we can cut something a little differently to reduce the waste, that's a big savings. I mean, we know what the ideal is for trimming carrots, and if we find out that when we trim carrots, we're trimming a lot more, there's a lot more going in the waste than we expected, we can go back and retrain somebody or give them a sharper knife, or there's different kinds of problems you can solve.
Wow, I had no idea it was at that level.
Yeah, the same kind of things happening at supermarkets and grocery stores. They're putting scales under the dumpsters and finding a lot about their business. So, and I mean, the tech just didn't exist 5, 6, 7 years ago. This is pretty new, and I think there's a lot more advances to happen in this area. So it's not that we'll eliminate waste altogether, but I think we should be seeing pretty serious gains in improving on those issues.
It is worth noting that our great-grandmothers solved this problem a while ago, and we've unsolved it. So my grandma loved canned food. Why did she love canned food? Because she knew that it wasn't going to go bad, and she didn't have to worry about it. She could throw it in the pantry and deal with it when the time came. She also, side note, feminist issue, she knew that it kept her from having to spend her day in the kitchen. So canned food is great for my great-grandma. Frozen hamburgers, 20 years ago, everybody was fine going to a fast food restaurant and ordering a burger that they knew had come from a frozen puck. Frozen hamburgers are really good for reducing food waste because the shelf life is a lot longer. The restaurant can put it in the freezer and take it out as needed. The waste is significantly reduced over fresh, which has a much shorter shelf life, and when it's gone, it's gone. But we've unsolved those problems because we have evolving tastes and we have different standards now of what we want to eat. We've gotten wealthy and we've gotten picky, and that's not bad. But it has created new food waste problems that now we've got to deal with in a whole new way. So I agree with Air. I think technology is a tremendous problem solver here, and we have found that when we are utilizing blockchain and other technologies to understand exactly where everything is every second of the day and all the things that influence just how long the shelf life is on a particular product and making sure nothing goes astray, these are great outcomes. But preserved foods and canned foods and all that kind of stuff, that was how your great-grandma solved that problem.
Let's go to Melissa. It's a tough question. Isn't the U.S. Farm Bureau one of the biggest obstacles to regenerating our agricultural lands to improve carbon sink? I think we touched on this a bit, but do you guys have anything else you want to add to that one?
Well, they're not helping.
Sorry, say that again.
I'd say they're not helping. And that's probably all I want to comment on in a public forum.
Who else wants to take on the Farm Bureau? Air.
Don't look at me. I run restaurants.
Okay.
I'll just note, we have some organizations in this country who are designated as representatives of our farmers, and they are representatives, not leaders. Their job is not to lead the farmers into the future and tell the farmers how they need to do things differently. Their job is to represent the views of those people today. So the people who are going to lead the farmers into the future are the farmers, not their organizations. So you've got to find the most progressive, forward-looking people who are respected in their community. Those are the folks who drive change in farm communities.
Wish I'd said that.
+1.
All right, back to anonymous with no happy face. So this is a different anonymous. Can you discuss the negative externalities of plant-based or lab-grown meat, such as health resources, food safety, et cetera? No, you can't think of anything negative.
We don't really know because lab-grown meat is still a mystery that we hope will happen someday. I mean, what's the lowest cost we've gotten per pound of lab-grown meat right now?
Yeah, I mean it's extremely high, but it's a little bit like asking how much what the lowest cost is you've gotten for an iPhone 2 years before there was an iPhone. The R&D before they had an iPhone was like $3.4 billion. Yeah. But I mean, they are producing, and every sort of processed food starts in a lab at scale. This product will be produced in a factory. It will look basically like a brewery, so it'll be sort of your friendly neighborhood meat brewery, essentially.
Well, they have brew pubs. They should, yeah.
No, exactly. And
Meat pub
like
things.
Memphis Meats talks about streaming their production online. I mean, it'll get boring in about 10 seconds, but it accentuates the difference between a modern farm or a slaughterhouse and what's happening in one of these places. This is another area where you drive around and you see cattle on the side of the road. You don't drive around and see chickens or turkeys or pigs on the side of the road. They're all intensively confined in ways that I think would shock the conscience of most people. And slaughterhouses are also unpleasant places. But I mean, the externalities of meat, which we've already discussed, are massive global health crisis from antibiotic resistance and other problems. No antibiotics required for plant-based meat or
So
clean
Bruce,
meat.
can I stop you there? Can you
Please.
speak to that a little bit more? So I don't know this. I don't know the answer to the question, so I'm actually asking legitimately. Are there no antibiotics used in the fermentation process or whatever it is that's happening in this laboratory to create this meat?
No, it's a thoroughly antiseptic. It's a thoroughly antiseptic reality. So for both plant-based meat, obviously, and then also for clean meat. Once they're producing at production scale, they don't require. I mean, antibiotic. I mean, it basically means death to life. So.
But we saw that when they were in ethanol production, they were using antibiotics. What we discovered was that ethanol producers were using antibiotics to control the fermentation process and to to make it all come out right, whatever the magic of the antibiotics were. But it was unexpected. We didn't know that they were going to do that. They did it. And then everyone had to deal with that reality. But that's not going to be necessary in order to control the processes in the
No, and our
lab-grown
expectation is that through the regulatory approval process, antibiotics won't even be allowed. And the reason for that is that if there were contamination in a batch, they could knock out the contamination by using antibiotics. And at least the people at like Memphis Meats and Mosa Meat and Super Meat, they don't want any company to be allowed to do that. For the PR debacle that would represent. So they think if a batch becomes contaminated, they should have to scrap it back to food waste.
But you're looking for regulation or some kind of
to make sure that
government
antibiotics are not
to ensure
used.
that that's true. Because my concern as a consumer is that naturally would just happen if somebody didn't tell me I couldn't do it.
I think that's right. Yeah, I think
Okay.
if there were a contaminated batch, and obviously, I mean, it's in everybody's interest not to have contaminated batches. But antibiotics right now, I mean, 70% of the antibiotics used produced by pharmaceuticals in the United States are fed to farm animals, and there are antibiotics that are banned here that are common in China. And obviously, superbugs don't know national or international boundaries. So, I mean, this stuff is really scary.
On some of the other externalities, I mean, we sell the Impossible meatball, which I love selling to somebody.
I just like saying that, the impossible.
I love selling it to somebody, but I'd much rather sell you the chickpea fritter, which is like our falafel ball. And from a climate standpoint, even though I like what Impossible is doing, and we're trying to help promote what they're doing with their restaurants, it's much better from a climate standpoint. So these externalities, if you eat that falafel ball than if you eat the meatball by like a factor of 10. The meatball's better than if you eat another meatball somewhere else that's made from cows, but it sort of sets it in between, going straight to vegetables for your calories and getting it from animals.
And that same sort of thing is true when you compare plant-based meat to cell-based meat. So cell-based meat still requires feeding. So where plant-based meat is 9 times more efficient than chicken, it's also plant-based meat 3 times more efficient than clean meat. So there are externalities, and absolutely, if you're eating, hummus, that's going to cause less climate change and be less resource intensive than plant-based meat, which requires processing. But one of the exciting things about plant-based meat is all the companies that are doing it are interested in getting their climate impact lower and lower and lower. So they're all improving in ways that.
But we're still very much in a trust me phase with these developing technologies, and I'm not opposed to them in any way. I think they're wonderful. But I do think we need to be honest with consumers about that. We haven't got robust life cycle assessments on the environmental impacts of these products. We haven't got full details around antibiotic usage or processing.
We do for the
needs or
plant-based,
whatever.
just to be clear.
I haven't seen them, right? I mean, I'm not
Impossible's
seeing...
website has a robust LCA, so does Beyond's.
I think this is really important. We have to give consumers all of this information, because right now we're sort of telling consumers it's an accepted truth that these products will be better than these products. I'm not sure that that's necessarily been established yet. So we need to provide as much information as we possibly can.
Okay. All right. 2 questions. I think we have time left for 2. All right. Kelly, what is the role of genetically modified foods in this discussion on climate change? You were talking before about DNA in foods.
I know. I want no part of that.
Yeah. Ugh. Gives me the heebies. So GMOs? You talk about that a little bit?
So the big input providers, people who sell...
What does that mean?
Yeah, a big farm input provider would be someone who sells fertilizer or chemicals or seeds. So this would be Monsanto, Bayer, DuPont, Dow, Syngenta, or BASF, are the sort of 6 largest in the world. There's a dominant narrative from them that, if you want to feed the world and you want to solve these problems, you need our technologies to do so. I don't have any evidence to believe that that's true. I think that we can use regenerative practices to both improve yields and dramatically improve the health and sustainability of our farms without GMOs and without those other technologies. I'm not personally against GMOs, but I don't think they have, an irreplaceable role to play in solving these problems.
Other thoughts? Okay, good. All right, one last anonymous without a smiley face. I liked it better. Anonymous is from now on. Smiley faces, I like that. All right. Do you think there's substantial opportunity for urban agriculture? Any books, podcasts you'd recommend? That's good. Good way to, yeah.
I mean, it's a great way for people to acquaint themselves with growing, and because if we have things growing here, you're a lot closer to it, and you might learn more about it. But if you crunch the numbers on it, I don't see how it's a serious answer to any of the stuff we're talking about. I don't know if there's differing points of view here. We've personally, we've been approached by a whole bunch of companies doing different varieties of urban agriculture over the years, and I wish them all well, but I just see I don't see that path quite how it's going to work. And somebody might come up in a few years with some new idea that really changes the paradigm. But I think right now, when you're talking about stacking containers or growing vertically or rooftop growing, you're talking about growing some sprouts or some other little things that you might use in a decorative element on a plate. But you're not really talking about the substantial calories that we consume.
One thing that's super cool about urban agriculture, I agree with that completely. It's not the solution, but if you look at what kids are eating, and adults actually, in the inner city, and you look at the food desert problem, they're eating what's familiar, they're eating what's in front of them. And there have been some pretty fascinating pilot projects that have been done. It's a group called the Fruit Tree Planting Foundation. I taught through Teach for America for 2 years in inner city Baltimore, and the Fruit Tree Planting Foundation was in Baltimore for 3 weeks, I think, going school to school, planting fruit trees with the kids. And they would involve the kids, and they'd plant the tree, and they'd go in and they'd give a presentation about fruit trees, and they'd give a presentation, and sort of growing your own food. There was a woman at Johns Hopkins named Antonio Demas that had a program. I don't know what happened to it, but it was fascinating. She would go in with vegetables and teach kids to cook with vegetables, and just the familiarity of doing it, then they'd create this awesome salad, and then they would eat the salad because they created the salad. And she would present about, this is what growth looks like, and this is, the farm, and this is where, and the kids were just wide-eyed and fascinated. So I think in terms of healthy eating, and especially healthy eating in the inner city, I could see urban farming as, at least from my experience, a part of the solution. It seemed pretty awesome.
I don't think our food should come from there, right? I mean, it's a really inefficient way to get food to the plate, and a hobbyist farmer, which is, I grew up on a hobby farm, and it was inefficient. We struggled. So it's a really poor yields as compared to professional farmers. If you have seen people who are trying to raise pigs in their backyard, right, the animal welfare outcomes are terrible. This is not a situation that you should be fooling around with if you're not willing to do the hard work of actually learning over time. America's farmers have actually been doing this for generations, and you might not necessarily love all the things that they've learned to do, but there are good economic reasons and good efficiency reasons for most of the practices that they've got. But it's deck chairs on the Titanic, really. I mean, we don't. We're probably not going to hurt anybody if somebody plants some apple trees.
All right. Wow.
Phew!
Never even thought of that as a risk. What?
Listen, there are things you don't fool around with. I'm just saying you don't do your own dental work. You probably don't need to grow your own food.
So
I don't need my grandma having to do that.
But community gardens do rock.
I'll take a slightly. I don't know if urban agriculture is going to provide a significant amount of our calories, but I do think that a lot of the problems that face us today with regard to obesity and metabolic disease have to do with the fact we've become disconnected from where our food comes from. We think Doritos are food. And a big part of the solution is reconnecting, and that starts with kids and having them understand, what fruits and vegetables look like as they come out of the ground, and cultivating them and eating them. And so while urban agriculture may not produce an enormous amount of calories, I think it's really important to get people more connected with the source of food, and urban agriculture could really help with that.
Pretty much anybody with a yard can have a garden. Anybody with a, anything can
and an
have,
apple
can
tree.
grow. And an
All right,
apple tree.
who's successfully grown a tomato in here?
Yeah, take that.
Well done.
And who's
Well done.
Home tomato growers.
yeah, and who's successfully homegrown tomato tasted about 1,000 times better than anything you can get even at Whole Foods.
Yeah.
Fabulous.
All right.
If it
good.
wasn't successful, you still you learn something about what it takes to grow a tomato.
But I'm a farm kid from the Midwest, and I'm telling you that waste just offends me. But it's all good. It's all good. Grow
All
your
right.
tomatoes. Have at it.
All right. Thank you, everybody. That was great. Great note to end on. We'll go home and plant fruit trees and tomatoes. Fantastic. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to everyone for coming, and please come to more events here. This is fantastic. Thank you for all the great questions.
Rain Friday night, ending on Saturday morning. This is 90.9 WBUR and on the web.